Right now, sitting in your closet, there is a piece of technology so chemically advanced that it can survive being submerged in a vat of sulfuric acid.
Oh, absolutely.
It can be baked in an oven at like 120 degrees Celsius without melting. It can actively pull humidity out of the air to regulate its own temperature.
Yeah.
And, if you hold a flame to it, it will literally put out its own fire.
Yeah, it's wild.
And the wildest part about this entire engineering marvel, it wasn't developed in some billion-dollar synthetic materials lab. It was grown on the back of a sheep.
It's honestly the ultimate testament to evolutionary engineering. I mean, we spend decades trying to synthesize materials that can do half of what this fiber does naturally just by existing.
Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be your guides through an intensely fascinating exploration of wool.
Right. We are unpacking a pretty comprehensive academic masterclass that details the science, the biological engineering, and the deep history of this material.
Yeah, and our mission for you today is to completely bridge the gap between that, everyday comfortable sweater you pull on when the weather turns cold and the mind-blowing microscopic cellular architecture that actually makes it all possible.
Because we're looking at possibly humanity's oldest known fiber, the very first material our ancestors ever figured out how to spin into yarn and fabric.
But this isn't some primitive, crude survival material, right?
No, not even close. When we look at early human history, we tend to associate the materials of the time with blunt force, like chipping away at flint, scraping animal hides.
Right, very basic stuff.
Exactly. But the utilization of wool represents this massive leap in technological understanding. Early humans didn't fully grasp the complex protein chemistry they were dealing with, obviously.
Sure.
But they recognized the macroscopic benefits of this incredibly sophisticated microscopic machinery. And what's truly remarkable is that thousands of years later, in an era where we can digitally print synthetic fabrics, this ancient material remains at the absolute pinnacle of performance apparel.
And the scale of that ongoing dominance is really what first caught my attention. Even surrounded by polyester, nylon, advanced elastan's global wool production sits at roughly 2 million tons every single year.
It's a staggering amount.
Let's just visualize that. 2 million tons of fiber physically grown, shorn, and processed, and about 60% of that mountain of material goes straight into the apparel industry.
It's literally clothing billions of people.
So how does a natural, biologically grown fiber maintain that kind of industrial footprint in the 21st century?
Well, the answer really comes down to the fundamental nature of the material itself. Synthetics like polyester or nylon are, at their core, extruded plastics.
Right.
They're manufactured by forcing a liquid chemical polymer through a microscopic hole, a spinneret, to create a long, continuous, uniform filament. It's a single, static structure.
Okay, so a solid filament of plastic.
Right. But wool, conversely, is defined by two critical characteristics. It is a protein, and it is multicellular.
So instead of a solid filament of plastic, we're dealing with a biological construct.
Precisely. It's a highly crimped, medium-weight staple fiber from domesticated sheep. Because it's a living protein structure built from countless specialized cells that all serve distinct mechanical and chemical purposes, it's dynamic.
It actually reacts to things.
Yes. It responds to moisture, it responds to temperature, and it responds to friction. A solid tube of extruded plastic just cannot mimic the complex, responsive behavior of thousands of specialized biological cells working in tandem.
And that geographic footprint to produce all those cells is equally massive. We know Australia is the traditional heavyweight, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, the image of the Australian outback is almost synonymous with massive flocks of merino sheep.
Australia definitely dominates the premium market. The arid, harsh conditions of the Australian landscape are actually ideal for producing incredibly fine, high-quality merino wool.
But when you look at the sheer raw volume, like globally across all grades, China has actually eclipsed Australia in total weight.
Yeah, that is a fascinating division of the global market. You have China pumping out the highest volume of raw material, while Australia holds the crown for the premium high-performance fibers.
And then there's New Zealand.
Right. New Zealand operates in a very specific, highly lucrative niche. They are the largest producer of wool overall behind those two giants, but they completely dominate the market for what's called crossbred wool.
What's crossbred wool used for?
It's a slightly coarser, highly durable fiber. It's essential for carpets, heavy upholstery, robust outerwear. And beyond that triad, you have countries like The US, Argentina, Turkey, Iran, the UK, India, Sudan, and South Africa, all contributing massive tonnages to the global supply chain.
I've also noticed a shift recently when I look at clothing tags. There's a growing presence of organic wool.
Yeah, but that is a very slow, highly regulated, and expensive shift.
Why is that?
Well, producing truly organic wool is incredibly difficult because it requires absolute control over the sheep's environment. The pastures cannot be treated with synthetic fertilizers or pesticides.
Oh.
And the sheep can't be treated with preventative chemical dips for parasites either. So managing a flock under those strict farming standards limits the supply dramatically.
So it's mostly coming from specialized farms.
Exactly. Mostly out of New Zealand and Australia.
Right.
And because the yield is lower and the labor is higher, it carries a noticeably higher price tag on the retail rack.
I mean, it makes sense that controlling a biological process is harder than controlling a chemical plant. But that biological diversity is also wool's greatest strength. Because we aren't just talking about one uniform type of sheep.
Not at all.
The sheer variety of animals producing these fibers represents an evolutionary arms race for survival in different climates. Let's explore this menagerie of fibers because the physical differences between them are staggering.
They really are.
I want to start with the absolute benchmark of quality, the Class 1 gold standard merino.
Right. To understand merino, you have to look at its structural density. The merino breed originally developed in Spain, and the fiber it produces is considered the pinnacle of clothing wool. The actual staple length, which is the length of an individual, shorn fiber, is relatively short, usually only growing between 1 and 5 inches. But the secret to merino isn't its length, it's its surface topography.
This is where the microscopic scale becomes so important. We measure the thickness of these fibers in micrometers, or microns, right?
Right.
Like a human hair is usually around 70 to 100 microns thick.
And merino is significantly finer than that. But more importantly, a single merino fiber has up to 118 microscopic scales packed into a single millimeter of its length.
Wait, 118 overlapping scales in 1 millimeter.
Exactly.
That means the surface isn't smooth at all. It's just a dense, continuous sequence of microscopic ridges.
Yeah, and those ridges, combined with the extreme fineness of the fiber, create the greatest amount of natural crimp or waviness found in any wool.
So the scales and the crimp work together.
Those two evolutionary adaptations are exactly what make merino so valuable. The crimp traps microscopic pockets of dead air, which create superior thermal insulation.
And the scales.
Those dense scales allow the short fibers to interlock tightly when spun. It creates an incredibly strong, fine, and elastic yarn that feels exceptionally soft against human skin.
Okay, so merino is our benchmark for softness and crimp. But what happens when we look at an animal that evolved in a completely different environment? Like, let's look at the alpaca up in the high altitudes of the Andes.
So the alpaca has evolved a fiber that prioritizes thermal efficiency at a lower weight. Alpaca fleece is significantly warmer than standard sheep's wool, but it's physically lighter.
Does it have that same crimp?
It doesn't have the same extreme crimp as merino, which actually gives it a much smoother, glossier finish. In terms of fineness, a high-quality alpaca fiber falls between 12 and 29 micrometers.
12 microns is incredibly fine. That's a fraction of the width of a human hair. And it comes with a built-in color palette, doesn't it?
It does. While it can be naturally white, alpacas produce stunning natural shades of deep browns, fawns, and absolute blacks. And because it lacks the heavy lanolin grease found in sheep's wool, it feels remarkably clean and silky right off the animal.
That's beautiful. Let's move from the Andes over to the high plateaus of the Himalayas and Mongolia.
Okay.
When people hear the word cashmere, they instantly associate it with extreme luxury and high price tags. What biological parameters legally define a fiber as true cashmere?
The legal and technical parameters for cashmere are incredibly strict, mostly to prevent counterfeiting. It must come from the undercoat of the cashmere goat.
Undercoat specifically.
Right. And to be classified as natural cashmere, the individual fiber diameter cannot exceed 18.5 micrometers, and the staple length must be longer than 3.175 centimeters.
Why those specific measurements? Like, what do those dimensions actually do for the fabric?
It really comes down to a structural property called nippability and loft. Because the fibers are so fine and of that specific length, they trap air beautifully without packing densely together.
So it's light.
Exactly. It provides an extreme level of lightweight insulation without adding physical bulk to the garment. You get the warmth of a heavy winter coat in a textile that feels light as a feather. That versatility means it can be spun into an ultrafine yarn for a delicate, translucent shawl, or a thicker yarn for a robust sweater, all while maintaining that weightless warmth.
The variety doesn't stop with hooved animals either. We also have to look at the Angora rabbit.
The down coat of the Angora rabbit, whether it's the English, French, German, or giant breed, is another study in extremes. These fibers push the limits of fineness, averaging around 12 to 16 micrometers.
I always see Angora garments with that distinct, fuzzy aura around them.
Yeah, that's referred to in the textile industry as the halo. Because the fibers are so incredibly fine and lightweight, the ends of the spun yarn naturally escape the twist and float on the surface of the fabric.
So it creates a visible cloud.
It creates a visible cloud of fluffiness. It's highly prized for its aesthetic softness, and the molecular structure of the rabbit hair makes it incredibly easy to felt.
Now, this brings up a major point of confusion in the textile world that we really need to clarify.
Yeah.
We just talked about Angora wool from the Angora rabbit.
Right.
But there's also an animal called the Angora goat.
Yes, and that naming convention has caused endless confusion for consumers. To be absolutely clear, the Angora rabbit produces Angora wool. The Angora goat produces a fiber called mohair.
And mohair behaves very differently than the rabbit's halo.
Completely differently. Mohair is renowned for being incredibly durable and highly resilient. It doesn't have that floating, fragile fluffiness. Instead, it's frequently described as having a silk-like structure.
So it's shiny.
It possesses an extreme natural luster and sheen. Because of that light-reflecting quality, textile manufacturers will often blend just a small percentage of mohair into other wools simply to add a glossy, premium finish to the final fabric.
That's a great trick.
It is. Furthermore, its cellular structure takes up synthetic dyes exceptionally well, allowing for brilliantly vibrant, saturated colors that just don't fade.
Okay, I need to push back on a concept here.
Sure.
We've just walked through a lineup of these ultra-fine, delicate fibers. 12 microns, 16 microns, 18.5 microns. These are fragile, luxurious materials. But then we introduced the American bison. Now, when I picture a bison, I picture a massive, rugged, prehistoric-looking beast surviving a brutal plains blizzard. And yet, the data shows the bison produces a downy undercoat that is exactly 18.5 micrometers, the exact same fineness as luxury cashmere.
Yeah.
Why on earth does a rugged animal like a bison produce an ultra-fine, delicate luxury fiber right alongside its rough, 59 micrometer coarse outer hair? What's the evolutionary mechanism at play here?
You really have to view it through the lens of survival thermodynamics. The environment the American bison evolved in is unforgiving. They face driving snow, freezing rain, relentless winds.
Right.
That coarse 59 micrometer outer layer of guard hair is their physical armor. It's thick, rigid, and highly weather resistant. It physically repels the snow and blocks the wind from penetrating. But thick armor is terrible at retaining body heat. It's too dense to trap air.
The armor stops the weather, but it doesn't actually keep the core warm.
Exactly. That is where the 18.5 micrometer downy undercoat becomes critical. Beneath that protective outer shell, the bison grows this incredibly fine, dense layer of luxury fiber.
Oh.
Because the fibers are so microscopic, millions of them pack together, creating billions of microscopic dead air pockets right against the animal's skin. Dead air is one of the greatest thermal insulators in the universe.
So it's a dual-layer system.
It's a dual-layer system that keeps the animal's core temperature perfectly stable in sub-zero conditions without weighing the animal down with a massive, heavy pelt. And they shed this fine undercoat annually when the weather warms up.
So when humans harvest bison down, or cashmere, we're literally just stealing their evolutionary thermal underwear.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. And making that distinction is vital because it highlights the mechanical difference between what we call hair or fur on a bison or an alpaca versus true wool on a sheep. They are not structurally identical.
Right. Earlier you mentioned the 118 scales on the merino. That isn't present on hair.
Not to the same extreme degree. True sheep's wool is defined by two unique structural pillars. First, it has prominent overlapping surface scales, heavily resembling the shingles on a roof. Second, it has a high degree of physical three-dimensional crimp. Some fine sheep fleeces have more than 20 distinct bends or waves per inch of fiber.
Wow.
Hair and fur, even the fine undercoats of bison or cashmere goats, generally lack that extreme, highly regular crimp, and their surface scales are much flatter and less pronounced. Those two specific traits, deep crimp and pronounced overlapping scales, are why true wool is so incredibly easy to spin into yarn and why it felt so effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. The crimp gives it the bounce, and the scales give it the friction to lock together. So we understand the evolutionary genius behind these different animals. We know what micron counts provide what benefits.
Yeah.
But this brings us to the physical reality of extraction. Because reading about this process, it is clear that taking this fiber from a living animal and turning it into a pristine sweater is an incredibly gritty, dirty, and physically demanding process.
Oh, absolutely.
The condition of the wool changes drastically depending on when and how it's harvested.
The classification of wool by its extraction method and the life stage of the sheep is really a foundational science in the textile industry. The timing of the shearing fundamentally alters the physical structure of the resulting fiber. Let's look at the baseline. Virgin wool.
You see 100% virgin wool on high-end garment labels all the time. It implies purity, but what does it technically dictate?
Technically, virgin wool simply means fibers that have been shorn from a living, healthy sheep. And most importantly, it means those fibers have never been processed or woven before.
So it's fresh.
It's the first time that specific fiber is seeing a loom, but within that broad category of virgin wool, you have highly specific age-based grades. The most delicate is lamb's wool.
Which comes from the very first shearing of the animal's life.
Yes, typically when the lamb is between 6 and 8 months old. Because this is the very first fleece the animal has ever grown, the fibers have never been cut by shears. This means the tip of every single fiber retains its natural biological taper. It comes to a microscopic, gentle point.
Instead of a blunt cut end like a freshly mowed lawn.
Exactly. Because of that naturally tapered tip, lamb's wool is exceptionally fine and unparalleled in its softness against the skin. It yields incredibly comfortable, premium garments. However, because the animal is young and the fiber is fine, it lacks the tensile strength of adult wool.
So as the sheep ages, the fiber gets stronger. Which brings us to hogget wool.
Hogget wool is a very specific, unique classification. It comes from a sheep that is older, usually 12 to 14 months old, but crucially, it's a sheep that has never been shorn before.
Wait, so they let the lamb's wool grow out for an extra 6 months?
Correct. So it still retains that biologically tapered tip, giving it incredible softness. But because the animal is older and more physically mature, the protein structure of the fiber is vastly stronger and highly elastic.
Oh, that's smart.
It's the perfect interception of delicate softness and mature structural integrity. Because of this high tensile strength, hogget wool is frequently utilized as warp yarn.
The warp yarn being the structural vertical threads on a loom that have to be held under extreme tension during the weaving process. You need a strong fiber for that.
Exactly. You wouldn't want to use delicate lamb's wool for a high-tension warp.
So we have the soft lamb's wool and the strong hogget wool. But what happens to the fiber after that first haircut? Once you shear a sheep, that natural tapered tip is gone forever.
Any fleece clipped from a sheep after its first shearing, typically from animals 14 months or older, is classified broadly as weather wool. And the name is literal.
Right.
This is where the physical environment begins to aggressively alter the chemistry and structure of the fiber. Weather wool has been exposed to the sun, the wind, the rain, and the dirt for months.
So the elements beat it up.
Exactly. The ultraviolet radiation from the sun physically degrades the protein bonds on the tips of the fibers. The abrasive action of wind and dirt strips away some of the outer cuticle scales. It becomes harsher, denser, and carries a significant load of soil.
And while weather wool is the standard for most commercial production, the classification tiers get significantly darker from there. Not all wool comes from a happy, healthy sheep getting a haircut.
No, the industry accounts for every possible source of fiber, and the lower tiers represent wool that has suffered severe biological or mechanical degradation. For instance, there's pulled wool.
What's that?
This is fiber that is chemically or biochemically removed from the pelt of a slaughtered sheep, usually as a byproduct of the meat industry, because the roots are chemically dissolved rather than cleanly shorn, and because the animal is dead, the fiber is lifeless, low quality, and generally relegated to low-grade cloth or insulation.
Then you have dead wool, which sounds entirely self-explanatory.
It's gathered from sheep that have died of natural causes, disease, or accidents out in the pastures. The microbial breakdown of the animal's body immediately begins to degrade the protein structure of the fleece. It's decidedly inferior, structurally weak, and used only in the cheapest applications.
There are also classifications based on the physical suffering of the live fleece, like coddy wool.
Cotton wool is a fascinating example of environmental impact. It comes from sheep that have been exposed to severe, unrelenting weather conditions or sheep that have suffered from severe malnutrition. Okay.
When the animal is deeply stressed, the biological production of the wool fat, the lanolin, drops drastically. Without that protective, lubricating grease, and combined with harsh winds and rain, the fibers aggressively tangle and selt together while still attached to the animal.
Oh, wow. On the sheet itself.
Yeah. The fleece becomes completely matted into a hard, brittle, solid mass. It loses all of its spinability and has to be violently torn apart to be used.
And finally, the lowest of the low, taglocks.
Taglocks are the heavily torn, intensely ragged, or deeply discolored parts of a normal fleece, usually from the legs or the hindquarters of the animal. During the initial sorting process, these heavily contaminated matted chunks are aggressively separated out and sold as the absolute lowest, inferior grade of fiber.
This actually raises a massive logistical question. We're producing 2 million tons of this material a year. What happens to the wool garments that we discard?
Well, we recycle them.
But we can't just keep piling up virgin wool indefinitely. How do you recycle a material that is designed to permanently lock together like a ratchet? The recycling of wool is an incredibly aggressive mechanical process, and the industry categorizes recovered wool based on how much physical violence the fiber had to endure during recycling. The hierarchy is basically based on staple length retention.
Let's start with the top tier of recycled fiber, shoddy.
Shoddy is the highest grade of recovered wool. It's sourced from recycled fabrics, yarns, or knitwear that have not been heavily milled or intensely felted in their previous life. Think of a loosely knit sweater.
Right.
Because the fibers aren't permanently locked together, the recycling machines, which essentially use massive steel pins to tear the fabric apart, can separate the individual fibers with relatively minimal breakage. The resulting recovered fiber retains enough length to be spun again into a decent quality yarn.
So shoddy is relatively undamaged. But if you try to recycle a tightly woven wool coat, you get mungo.
Correct. Mungo is sourced from heavily milled, tightly woven, or intentionally felted cloths, materials like dense velour or heavy overcoat fabrics. In these garments, the microscopic scales of the wool fibers have been intentionally locked together.
So tearing it apart must be a nightmare.
Tearing that fabric back into raw fiber is an incredibly violent mechanical process. The steel pins of the recycling machines physically snap and shatter the locked fibers. The resulting mungo fiber is heavily damaged, extremely short, and very weak. It usually has to be blended with long staple virgin wool or strong synthetic fibers just to hold together in a new yarn.
The physics of that makes total sense. You're trying to pull apart a microscopic zip tie, it's going to snap. But what if the wool's blended? What if it's a wool-cotton blend? You can't just rip that apart mechanically and separate the two fibers.
That requires the third tier of recovery, extract. And this moves from mechanical violence to chemical violence. If you have a fabric that's a blend of wool and a plant-based fiber like cotton or rayon, the recyclers utilize a chemical process called carbonizing.
Carbonizing.
Right. They submerge the blended fabric in a highly concentrated acid bath. The acid literally attacks and dissolves the cotton or rayon, completely destroying the plant matter, leaving only the chemically resilient extracted wool behind.
The carbonizing process is arguably the most mind-bending part of this entire deep dive. We're going to explore that step by step in a moment. But first, we need to talk about the physical reality of the harvest itself.
Sure.
Because reading the breakdown of what comes off a sheep's back during shearing is genuinely shocking. The data states that a single healthy male sheep, a ram, yields roughly 20 pounds of raw wool in a single shearing.
Yep.
But then it drops a massive caveat.
Yep.
It states that 30 to 70% of that 20-pound weight is pure contamination. If I'm understanding this correctly, more than half of a sheared fleece is just dirt, grease, and biological waste.
That is the gritty reality of natural fibers. When you pick up a raw, freshly shorn fleece, it feels incredibly heavy and dense. But that weight is an illusion. It's deeply, heavily contaminated. If we look at the exact average chemical breakdown of a raw, unwashed fleece, only 33% of that massive weight is actual keratin, the wool protein fiber itself.
Only 1/3 of the weight is usable wool. What exactly comprises the other 67%?
It's a cocktail of environmental and biological debris. On average, 26% of the weight is pure dirt, sand, and dust that the sheep has rolled in. 28% of the weight is a substance called suint.
Suint. That is a highly specific textile term. What is it?
Suint is the technical term for the dried residue of sheep's sweat.
Oh, lovely.
Biologically, it consists primarily of potassium salts of various fatty acids. As the sheep sweats to regulate its temperature, the moisture evaporates, leaving these heavy potassium salts permanently encrusted deep within the fleece.
So we have 33% wool, 26% dirt, 28% dried sweat. What's the rest?
Roughly 12% is wool fat, which is secreted by the sebaceous glands of the sheep to waterproof the fleece. This fat is highly valuable on its own.
Like lanolin.
Exactly. Once extracted and refined, it's called lanolin, and it's the base for countless cosmetics, lotions, and pharmaceutical ointments. The final 1% is various trace mineral matter.
That is an astonishing chemical load. So when the shearers take this fleece, roll it up, and compress it for shipping, the data says they use massive hydraulic presses to compact the wool into a bale, which is a standardized 330-kilogram pack wrapped tightly in heavy plastic and secured with high-tension wire.
Right.
You're telling me that a massive percentage of the weight in millions of these 330-kilo bales being shipped across the oceans is just Australian dirt and dried sheep sweat.
Exactly. It's highly inefficient from a transport perspective, but you cannot aggressively wash the wool at the shearing shed without risking damage to the fiber. So the raw, greasy fleece is graded on the spot by an expert classer.
They sort it while it's dirty.
Yes. They rapidly evaluate the fleece based on its fineness, the regularity of its crimp, its staple length, the level of impurities, and its base color. They sort it into 4 primary classes, with Class 1 being the absolute premium, and Class 4 being highly coarse, hair-like fibers with minimal elasticity, destined for heavy carpets. But regardless of the class, the vast majority of that contamination is still locked inside the bale when it goes on the ship.
Which means that once the bale arrives at a textile mill, getting from a heavy, grease-soaked, dirt-filled, sweat-encrusted fleece to a pristine, bright white, incredibly soft merino sweater requires a cleaning effort of monumental proportions. You can't just throw this in a giant washing machine with some laundry detergent.
Not even close. It requires a highly engineered multi-stage chemical and mechanical gauntlet. And the most intense, unforgiving part of that gauntlet is the process you teased earlier, the carbonizing process.
Let's dive deep into carbonizing, because when I look at the 12 steps required to execute this, it doesn't read like a textile manufacturing process. It reads like an industrial chemical separation designed to physically destroy one material while miraculously preserving another.
It really is.
It feels like we are subjecting the wool to a trial by fire and acid. What is the fundamental goal of carbonizing?
At its foundational core, the goal of carbonizing is the absolute removal of cellulosic impurities from the protein matrix of the wool.
Cellulosic impurities, meaning plant matter.
Exactly. Vegetable matter. As a sheep wanders through pastures and scrubland for a year, its fleece acts like a giant sticky mop. It collects burrs, seeds, thorny branch segments, twigs, and tough grasses.
Right.
Because the wool is highly crimped and covered in microscopic scales and heavily coated in that sticky lanolin grease, this plant matter becomes inextricably tangled deep inside the fiber structure.
Anyone who has ever walked through a field in a wool sweater or a pair of thick wool socks knows exactly how impossible it is to physically pull a burr out of the fabric it locks in. So doing that by hand on 2 million tons of wool is impossible.
Which is why the industry relies on chemistry. But they face a massive paradox. To destroy the tough, woody plant matter, they use highly concentrated, corrosive sulfuric acid.
And this is the paradox. How can you possibly take a delicate, ultra-fine 18-micron luxury protein fiber, submerge it in strong sulfuric acid, and not completely obliterate it?
It works because of a brilliant, highly specific loophole in organic chemistry. Wool is a biological protein fiber built from keratin. Plant matter, the burrs and twigs, is a cellulosic fiber built from complex carbohydrates. It turns out that protein fibers and cellulosic fibers have completely inverted chemical vulnerabilities.
Explain that inversion.
Well, wool protein is highly resistant to mineral acids. Because of the specific arrangement of its amino acids and its isoelectric point, you can practically boil wool in acid, and the protein chains will remain largely intact and structurally sound.
Okay, so it ignores acid.
Right. However, wool is highly sensitive to and easily destroyed by alkalized basic solutions. Plant cellulose operates in the exact opposite manner. Plant matter easily survives exposure to strong alkalis, but it is rapidly and violently dehydrated and destroyed by hot mineral acids.
That is incredibly elegant. You weaponize the acid to attack the carbohydrate structure of the plant, knowing with absolute chemical certainty that the protein structure of the wool will ignore the attack.
Precisely. It's a targeted chemical strike. But executing that strike requires a grueling, 12-step conventional technique to ensure the wool isn't accidentally damaged in the crossfire.
Let's walk the listener through this 12-step gauntlet. Step 1 and 2 seem relatively standard.
Step 1 is scouring. The raw, greasy wool is washed in massive, long baths using a non-ionic detergent. The goal here is just to lift the surface dirt, dissolve the heavy lanolin fat, and wash away the water-soluble potassium salts of the soot.
And step 2.
Step 2 is a thorough, aggressive water rinse to remove those scouring agents.
So now we have relatively clean, wet wool, but it's still full of burrs and twigs. Step 3 is where the chemistry gets aggressive.
Step 3 is immersion. The wet wool is mechanically fed into a long, lead-lined or acid-resistant bowl containing a highly concentrated 5 to 7% solution of sulfuric acid. They mix in a specialized acid-stable detergent to help the acid penetrate deeply into the fibers. The temperature is kept relatively low here, between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. The wool literally takes a bath in corrosive acid.
Step 4 is extraction.
Right. Double squeezing or continuous centrifuging. They use massive mechanical pressure or centrifugal force to violently wring out the excess sulfuric acid. They need the wool to be evenly damp with the acid, but not dripping wet, to ensure an even reaction later.
Step 5 is a preliminary drying phase at 60 to 80 degrees Celsius to bring the overall moisture content down. Step 6. Step 6 is the crucible, baking.
Baking is where the actual chemical destruction occurs. The acid-dampened wool is conveyed into a massive industrial oven and subjected to temperatures between 95 and 120 degrees Celsius.
120 degrees Celsius. That's significantly above the boiling point of water. I'm trying to picture how a biological hair doesn't just melt and incinerate at that temperature while soaked in acid.
It survives because the heat is acting as a catalyst for the acid to attack the cellulose, not the protein. Inside that 120-degree oven, a violent dehydration synthesis occurs within the plant matter.
Dehydration synthesis.
Yes. The heat causes the sulfuric acid to violently strip the hydrogen and oxygen atoms out of the carbohydrate molecules of the burrs and twigs. It literally rips the water out of the plant's molecular structure. When you remove the water from a carbohydrate, all that's left behind is pure, black, brittle carbon.
So inside this oven, every single twig, burr, and seed physically blackens and chars into a crisp piece of charcoal. But because of the chemical loophole, the resilient wool protein simply absorbs the heat and remains structurally flexible.
Exactly. The plant matter is chemically destroyed, but it's still physically tangled inside the wool. It hasn't vanished, it's just changed states, which requires step 7. Crushing.
We move from chemical violence to mechanical violence.
The wool, still hot from the oven and containing these charred bits of carbon, is passed through a series of massive, incredibly heavy, fluted iron rollers. Because the vegetable matter has been chemically embrittled and turned into rigid carbon, it possesses no flexibility.
So it just breaks.
Exactly. When the heavy fluted rollers compress the fleece, the carbonized burrs simply shatter. They're pulverized into a fine black dust. But the wool protein, which is highly elastic and springy, simply compresses under the heavy rollers and bounces right back unharmed.
The wool bends, the carbon breaks. It's a perfect mechanical separation based on the newly altered physical properties of the materials.
Step 8 is separation. The fleece is conveyed into a rapidly rotating shaker or mechanical deduster. The aggressive shaking literally vibrates all of that pulverized, charred carbon dust right out of the web of the fiber.
So the plant matter is completely gone. It's been charred, crushed, and shaken out as dust. But the wool is still saturated with the residual sulfuric acid from step 3. You can't just leave it like that.
No. If you leave the acid in the fiber, it will eventually degrade the protein over time, and it makes the wool impossible to dye safely. So step 9 is neutralizing. The wool is passed through another massive bowl, this time containing a solution of sodium carbonate.
Sodium carbonate is an alkali, a base.
Exactly. It's a classic acid-base neutralization reaction. The alkali aggressively neutralizes the residual sulfuric acid within the fiber. But remember, our chemical loophole wool is highly sensitive to alkalis.
Right.
So this step has to be monitored with extreme precision. If the sodium carbonate solution is too strong, or if the wool stays in too long, the alkali will begin to dissolve the very wool we just worked so hard to protect.
It's a chemical tightrope walk. Step 10 is a final rinse.
A deep rinse with a small addition of detergent to completely wash away the neutralized salts and any lingering chemical residue.
But the visual aesthetics might still be ruined at this point. After acid, heat, and carbon dust, the wool might look pretty dingy.
Which necessitates step 11, bleaching. If the wool is discolored, it's treated with hydrogen peroxide to oxidize and remove the color pigments, restoring a brilliant white finish. What's vital here is the pH balance of the bleaching bath. The process specifies maintaining a pH of approximately 5, utilizing formic acid.
They intentionally keep the bleaching bath slightly acidic.
Because they know wool prefers an acidic environment over an alkaline one. It protects the structural integrity of the protein while the peroxide does its oxidative work.
And finally, step 12.
Final drying. The wet, clean, chemically purified wool is dried down to its natural moisture equilibrium. Out of the end of this massive industrial machine comes incredibly pure, incredibly clean wool, entirely free of plant matter, ready to be spun into high-quality worsted piece goods or luxurious woolens.
Consider the physics of that for a moment. We take a biological fiber grown on a sheep. We soak it in strong sulfuric acid. We bake it at 120 degrees Celsius. We crush it under heavy iron rollers. We chemically neutralize it with an alkali. We bleach it with peroxide, and it survives.
It's amazing.
It doesn't just survive, it thrives. It emerges ready to be spun into a high-performance garment. If wool can survive that kind of relentless chemical and mechanical assault, its internal cellular structure cannot just be a simple thread. It has to be an absolute fortress of biology. So let's zoom in.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the wool fiber under a high-powered electron microscope and take a journey to the center of the fiber to understand how it survives this.
When you view wool under a microscope, its morphological structure is a masterclass in specialized cellular engineering. It's not a uniform tube. It's a complex, multi-layered organism. It consists of 3 primary distinct components: the cuticle on the outside, the cortex in the middle, and in some specific cases, the medulla at the very center.
Let's start on the outside defensive perimeter and work our way into the core, the cuticle. We briefly touched on this earlier when we discussed the 118 scales on the merino fiber, but how does the surface actually function structurally?
The cuticle is the outermost protective layer, and it's composed of flattened, hardened epithelial cells that heavily overlap each other, exactly like overlapping shingles or tiles on a roof. But the complexity doesn't stop there. The cuticle itself is subdivided into 3 distinct chemical layers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The epicuticle is the microscopic, very outermost skin. The exocuticle is the robust middle layer of the scale. And the endocuticle is the highly specific, intermediate bonding layer that physically anchors the external scales to the internal core of the fiber.
And these overlapping roof tiles aren't just for armor. They serve a highly specific, active mechanical purpose when the fiber is in motion.
They govern the entire friction profile of the material. The exposed, serrated edges of every single cuticle scale all point in the exact same direction they face, away from the root end of the fiber, and point toward the tip. This creates what physicists call directional friction.
Like petting a cat. If you stroke a wool fiber from the root toward the tip, your finger glides smoothly over the flatbacks of the scales. But if you reverse direction and stroke from the tip back down toward the root, it feels rough and abrasive. You're physically catching your finger against the microscopic, raised edges of the scales.
That precise mechanism of directional friction is the entire engine behind the concept of felting. When you subject a mass of wool fibers to mechanical agitation in the presence of heat and moisture, like tossing a wool sweater into a hot, aggressive washing machine cycle, the fibers are forced to move around and slide against one another.
But because of those scales, they can't move freely.
Right. Because of the directional friction, an individual fiber can only easily glide in one direction, toward its root. As the fibers are violently agitated, they slide past each other, but the moment they try to reverse direction, the serrated edges of the scales catch onto the scales of the adjacent fibers.
Like little ratchets.
Exactly like microscopic zip ties or mechanical ratchets. They slide, lock, slide, lock. The fibers become permanently, inextricably entangled and drawn tightly together. The fabric physically shrinks and condenses into a dense, solid mat. That is how we manufacture industrial felt, and that is exactly why your expensive sweater shrinks into a tiny, rigid block if you wash it incorrectly.
That is fascinating. The scales are literally ratcheting the fibers together. But the cuticle isn't just mechanical. It has a massive chemical trick up its sleeve regarding water.
The outermost layer of the cuticle, the epicuticle, features a highly specialized waxy coating that is chemically covalently bound to the surface of the scales. This waxy layer is highly hydrophobic. It physically repels liquid water and makes the fiber highly resistant to water-based stains.
Oh, that makes sense.
If you step out into a light rainstorm in a wool pea coat, or if you spill a drop of water on the sleeve, the water droplet will bead up perfectly and simply roll off the fabric. The liquid cannot penetrate the waxy surface tension.
But here is the genius of it. It stops liquid water from the outside. But if you're sweating inside the coat, you don't feel clammy. It breathes.
Because while the waxy scales repel liquid droplets, the microscopic gaps between the overlapping scales are large enough to allow water vapor evaporated gas to pass freely through the armor and be absorbed by the inner core of the fiber. It's a one-way valve for moisture.
It stops external liquid rain, but actively vents internal vapor sweat. Human material scientists spent billions of dollars and decades of research developing synthetic membranes like Gore-Tex to achieve that exact, precise function. And sheep evolved it millions of years ago, just standing in a field.
It is the pinnacle of biological weatherproofing. But the cuticle is just the shell. To understand the engine of fiber, we have to look past the scales and examine the core, the cortex.
The structural data says the cortex forms a massive 90% of the fiber's total volume. This is the absolute meat of the wool.
It's the structural foundation. The cortex is composed of millions of long, spindle-shaped cortical cells packed tightly together. But here is the absolute mind-blowing genius of wool's internal design. The cortex is not a uniform mass.
What do you mean?
It's biologically divided into two completely different, chemically distinct types of cells, the orthocortex and the paracortex.
Why build the core out of two different materials?
To create movement. In a high-quality fiber like merino, these two distinct halves literally spiral and twist around one another continuously along the entire longitudinal axis of the fiber. The orthocortex cells are chemically structured to be highly absorbent. They rapidly pull in moisture and dye molecules. The paracortex cells are much denser and significantly less absorbent.
So you have a single microscopic fiber where one half is designed to drink water and the other half resists it. What happens when the humidity rises?
When the environmental humidity rises, or when the sheep sweats, the orthocortex absorbs that water vapor and physically swells and expands. The paracortex absorbs very little and remains relatively static. Because the two halves are permanently bonded together, the side that is expanding exerts massive physical force on the side that isn't.
It's acting exactly like a bimetallic strip in a thermostat. When one metal expands faster than the other under heat, the strip is physically forced to bend and coil.
That is the exact mechanism. This differential expansion and spiraling arrangement is the biological engine that physically creates the crimp in the wool. The springiness, the waviness, isn't just a static shape the hair grows in. It's a dynamic, physical reaction caused by two microscopic halves of the fiber constantly fighting against each other as they interact with ambient moisture.
That is unbelievable. The fiber is actively coiling and uncoiling based on the humidity of its environment.
In fine wools, where the ortho and para cells form two perfectly distinct spiraling halves, you get a highly regular, extremely pronounced, bouncy crimp. In coarser, lower-grade wools, these two cell types are arranged much more randomly and chaotically within the core, which results in a much flatter fiber with far less crimp.
And as we established, that crimp is everything.
Right. It makes the fiber behave like a microscopic spring, giving wool garments their incredible elasticity and wrinkle resistance, while simultaneously trapping those billions of dead air pockets for supreme thermal insulation.
So we have millions of these spindle-shaped cortical cells fighting each other. How do they not just pull themselves apart under that stress? How are they bonded together?
They're encapsulated and held firmly together by a vital structure called the cell membrane complex. If you visualize the cortical cells as individual bricks, the cell membrane complex is the biological mortar holding the entire wall together. This complex runs continuously through the entire length of the fiber and is composed of specialized non-keratinous proteins and waxy lipids.
Does this mortar have a functional role, or is it just glue?
It has a massive functional role in processing. Because the mortar is slightly less dense than the rigid keratin bricks, it acts as the primary chemical highway.
A highway for what?
For dye. When you dye a wool garment, the microscopic dye molecules travel straight down the pathways of the cell membrane complex to rapidly enter and penetrate deep into the cortex. However, because its intermolecular bonds are weaker than the keratin itself, it's the Achilles heel of the fiber. Prolonged physical abrasion or exposure to harsh, aggressive chemicals will break down this membrane mortar, causing the cortical cells to separate. The fiber literally splinters and degrades.
Okay, we are deep into the core now. We have the roof tile cuticle on the outside. We have the spiraling, warring ortho and paracortical cells making up the 90% volume. We have the cell membrane mortar holding them together. But the microscopic architecture goes even deeper, doesn't it? Inside the cortical cells themselves.
It's truly like a biological Russian nesting doll. If we slice open one of those microscopic, spindle-shaped cortical cells, we find that it's packed entirely with long, parallel filaments called macrofibrils. If we magnify and look inside one of those macrofibrils, we find bundles of even finer, submicroscopic filaments called microfibrils.
We are getting down to the absolute molecular level here.
We are. These microfibrils contain pairs of highly twisted, highly organized molecular polymer chains. But they aren't just floating in empty space. The macro and microfibrils are densely embedded within a highly amorphous chemical substance called the matrix.
I want to use an analogy here to help visualize this structure. If the cortex is a structural column, the microfibrils act exactly like high-tensile steel rebar rods. They run vertically up the column, providing immense structural strength, load-bearing capacity, and flexibility. But rebar alone can't hold a shape. It needs concrete poured around it to lock it in place. The highly organized microfibril polymer chains are the steel rods, and the amorphous chemical matrix is the biological concrete locking the rods in place.
That is a flawless structural analogy. And the chemical makeup of that biological concrete, the matrix, is what dictates wool's most magical properties. The matrix is built almost entirely out of high-sulfur proteins.
High sulfur. Why is the presence of sulfur atoms so critical?
Because sulfur atoms are highly hydrophilic. They possess a massive natural chemical attraction to water molecules. Remember how the vapor passes through the waxy cuticle? Once inside, the high sulfur matrix acts like an aggressive chemical sponge. Because of this specific protein chemistry, a wool fiber can rapidly absorb up to 30% of its own dry weight in water vapor from the surrounding atmosphere.
And it does this without actually feeling wet to the human touch.
Exactly. The water molecules are pulled so deeply into the chemical structure of the matrix that the surface of the fiber remains entirely dry.
Let's apply that to a real-world scenario. You're hiking up a mountain in the winter wearing a heavy wool base layer. You start to exert yourself, and your body begins to sweat to cool down. If you're wearing polyester, that sweat condenses into liquid water, sits against your skin, and you freeze the second you stop moving.
Right.
But with wool, the high-sulfur matrix actively pulls the moisture vapor off your skin, pulling it deep into the internal concrete of the fiber, keeping your skin dry. Meanwhile, the exterior waxy cuticle is simultaneously repelling the external snow from penetrating.
It's actively managing the microclimate of your body. Furthermore, that sulfur matrix is the specific chemical engine behind two other legendary properties of wool. First, its fire resistance. Wool is incredibly difficult to ignite.
That's true, it doesn't burn easily.
If you hold a lighter to a synthetic polyester shirt, it instantly melts into liquid burning plastic that adheres to the skin. It's incredibly dangerous. If you hold a lighter to a wool sweater, the high moisture content locked in the matrix requires immense thermal energy to evaporate before the fiber can even reach an ignition point.
So the water acts like a shield.
Exactly. When it finally does burn, the high nitrogen and sulfur content causes it to merely char, sputter, and smell distinctly like burning horn or hair. The moment you remove the external flame, it actively self-extinguishes.
It refuses to sustain a flame. And the second property?
Anti-static performance. Static electricity builds up in utterly dry environments as friction transfers electrons. Because the high-sulfur matrix of wool is constantly pulling ambient moisture out of the air, it retains enough internal electrical conductivity to constantly harmlessly dissipate static charges before they can build up. That's why wool garments rarely cling to you with static electricity the way cheap synthetics do in dry winter air.
We've dissected the cuticle, the cortex, and the matrix. There is one final morphological component mentioned in the text, the medulla.
The medulla is the deepest, innermost structure, but you will almost never find it in high-quality fine merino wool. It's a biological void. It's a hollow, fragmented airspace running longitudinally down the absolute dead center of the fiber.
Why does it exist if it's not in the good wool?
It's primarily found in coarse, highly primitive, lower-grade wools and guard hairs. Its biological purpose in those coarse fibers is to provide massive bulk air trapping for extreme insulation. Think of the hollow hairs of a polar bear.
Okay, that makes sense.
But from a textile manufacturing perspective, a large medulla weakens the tensile strength of the fiber and completely disrupts how dye molecules reflect light, resulting in a dull, uneven color. Under a microscope cross-section, a premium merino fiber looks like a solid, incredibly dense circle of packed cortical cells. A coarse, medullated fiber looks like a thick donut with a dark, hollow, empty void in the middle.
Okay, we have systematically broken down the physical architecture of this material. We've gone from the overlapping roof tile scales down to the molecular steel rods and the highly absorbent sulfur concrete. We've reached the bottom.
We have.
This pivots our discussion perfectly to the absolute fundamental chemical reality of wool. We need to look at the periodic table. When we boil away the biology, what exactly is this fiber composed of?
Chemically, the fundamental building block of the entire wool fiber is a highly complex biological polymer known as keratin. To understand its scale, polymer chemists measure the size of these molecular chains by determining their degree of polymerization, or DP.
The structural data notes that the DP of a wool keratin fiber ranges dramatically from 60,000 to 100,000. For the listener who isn't a polymer chemist, what does that massive number actually represent?
A polymer is a large molecule made up of repeating subunits linked together, like links in a chain. The degree of polymerization essentially counts how many of those repeating units, in this case, complex amino acids, are chemically linked together to form one single molecule. A DP of 60,000 to 100,000 means we are dealing with unimaginably long, massive, structurally robust, ladder-like polypeptide chains.
And what specific atomic elements are linking together to form these massive 100,000 linked chains?
If we break the pure keratin protein down into its absolute elemental composition, it's remarkably consistent. By weight, it's exactly 50% carbon, 25% nitrogen, 12% hydrogen, 10% oxygen, and an incredibly vital 3% sulfur.
How do those 5 specific elements dictate the behavior of the fiber compared to something like cotton?
Those 5 elements combine to form nearly 20 different, incredibly bulky, complex amino acids. Because these amino acid groups are so large and awkwardly shaped, they cannot pack tightly together in perfect, rigid, crystalline rows. They arrange themselves in a highly disorganized, amorphous structure.
Meaning it's messy.
Yes, but that messiness is key. Contrast that with cotton, which is pure cellulose. Cotton molecules pack tightly together into highly organized, rigid, crystalline structures. That makes cotton strong, but inelastic and rigid. Wool's highly amorphous, bulky protein structure is exactly what gives the fiber its immense elasticity, its flexibility, and its ability to absorb so much water into the gaps between the molecules.
But if the molecular chains are messy and disorganized, they still have to be strongly bonded together to create the tensile strength necessary to survive the 120-degree carbonizing ovens. The analysis highlights 3 highly specific types of molecular bonds that cross-link and lock this entire 100,000-link keratin ladder together.
The structural integrity of the entire wool polymer relies entirely on these interpolymer forces. The first and most numerous are the polar peptide groups, which form hydrogen bonds.
Explain how a hydrogen bond works within this protein.
Along the long polymer chains, you have oxygen atoms within carbonyl groups that carry a slight negative electrical charge. On adjacent chains, you have hydrogen atoms within amino groups carrying a slight positive charge. Like magnets, the slight negative oxygen attracts the slight positive hydrogen. These hydrogen bonds pull the long chains toward each other.
So they attract each other.
They're relatively weak individually, but because there are millions of them along the length of the chain, they provide significant cohesive strength and elasticity.
So hydrogen bonds are the flexible magnets holding the chains near each other. What's the second type of bond?
Salt linkages, which are technically ionic bonds. Within the complex amino acids, you have carboxyl radicals that function as acidic chemical groups and amino radicals that function as basic chemical groups.
Acid and...
Right. When an acidic group on one chain aligns with a basic group on another chain, their opposite electrical charges strongly attract and neutralize each other, forming a powerful ionic bond, a salt linkage, that firmly cross-links the 2 polymer chains together.
And the third bond. The analysis makes it very clear that this specific bond is the absolute anchor of the entire system, and it's entirely unique to wool compared to other common fibers.
The covalent bonds. Specifically, the disulfide bonds, we must return to that critical 3% sulfur content. Wool keratin contains a highly specific sulfur-bearing amino acid called cysteine.
Cysteine?
Yes. When cysteine molecules on adjacent polymer chains align, their sulfur atoms chemically react and share electrons, creating an incredibly powerful, incredibly rigid covalent crosslink called a disulfide bond.
So it's much stronger than the hydrogen bonds.
If the hydrogen bonds are flexible magnets, the disulfide bonds are welded steel girders physically bolting the polymer chains together. This specific bond is the ultimate anchor. It's what gives wool its immense structural resilience, its ability to recover from stretching, and its unparalleled resistance to chemical and environmental degradation.
It's a chemical fortress built from hydrogen magnets, ionic salt links, and welded disulfide girders. But despite this brilliant architecture, despite surviving sulfuric acid baths and extreme heat, we must address the reality of its physical vulnerabilities. Because when you look at the physical performance data, this superfiber has some highly specific, glaring weaknesses. Let's start with its raw strength.
The breaking strength of a fiber is measured in a metric called tenacity. When a wool fiber is completely dry, its tenacity is measured at 1.35 grams per denier.
Which means it's reasonably strong, though not as strong as silk or synthetic nylon.
Correct. But the vulnerability arises when the fiber is introduced to water. When wool becomes completely saturated, its tenacity drops drastically, plummeting from 1.35 down to a weak 0.69 grams per denier. It loses roughly half of its structural strength simply by getting wet.
Wait, I'd stop you there. We just spent 20 minutes discussing how the absolute genius of the orthocortex and the high sulfur matrix is their ability to aggressively absorb massive amounts of water vapor. If it's biologically engineered to absorb moisture, why does water physically weaken the structure?
It comes down to what the water molecules do when they get inside the matrix. When massive amounts of liquid water flood the fiber, the tiny water molecules physically force their way into the microscopic spaces between the long polymer chains.
Okay.
When they do this, they aggressively interrupt and break those millions of weak polar peptide hydrogen bonds we just discussed.
They break the flexible magnets holding the chains together.
Precisely. The water molecules essentially act as an internal chemical lubricant and a physical wedge. By neutralizing the hydrogen bonds, the polymer chains are no longer strongly attracted to each other. They can slide past one another much more easily.
So it stretches.
As a result, when you apply tension to a wet wool fiber, the internal chains slip and the fiber stretches drastically before ultimately snapping at a much lower application of force. In fact, its elongation at break increases from roughly 35% when dry up to nearly 50% when wet, entirely because the water allows the chains to slip.
That structural reality fundamentally changes how you have to treat the material in everyday life. If you pull a soaking wet, heavy wool sweater out of a wash basin, you should never aggressively wring it out or twist it. By doing so, you're applying extreme mechanical tension to polymer chains that have been temporarily stripped of their hydrogen bonds. You will physically stretch, warp, and snap the fibers, permanently ruining the garment.
Exactly. You must gently press or roll the water out, laying it flat to dry so the hydrogen bonds can reform in their proper alignment as the water evaporates. And we also know it suffers from terrible dimensional stability due to the ratchet effect felting shrinkage we explored earlier.
Beyond water and mechanical agitation, we also noted it's highly vulnerable to certain chemicals. It ignores acid, but it's destroyed by alkalis.
That is its most fatal chemical weakness. If you were to drop a piece of premium wool into a strong solution of caustic soda, a powerful alkali, and apply a little heat, the alkali will aggressively attack and dissolve the chemical bonds of the keratin.
Oh, man.
The entire structure will liquefy into a foul-smelling, ruined sludge. A chemical solution that wouldn't even slightly damage a simple cotton t-shirt will completely obliterate a biological wool sweater.
It also mentions vulnerabilities to intense radiation and specialized biology.
Yes. Prolonged, intense exposure to the ultraviolet radiation in direct sunlight will physically degrade the protein bonds near the surface of the fiber. Over time, the wool will discolor, turning a dull yellow, and the damaged cuticle scales will cause the fabric to develop a harsh, brittle, scratchy feel. And biologically, because it's a natural organic protein, it's quite literally food.
the bane of every vintage clothing collector.
Yeah.
Moths.
Exactly. If left damp and in the dark, naturally occurring microorganisms will cause mildew that rapidly rots the structural protein. Furthermore, specific insects, most notably the larvae of the common clothes moth, have evolutionarily developed highly specialized digestive enzymes in their gut that are capable of breaking down and metabolizing keratin protein. They will literally eat right through the molecular architecture of your wardrobe to survive.
So we are looking at an incredibly tough, highly engineered superfiber that can survive an industrial acid bath, but can simultaneously be dissolved into sludge by a basic household soap, weakened drastically by a heavy rainstorm, and eaten alive by a tiny moth larva. It's a brilliant study in biological contradictions, which leads to a really interesting practical question about the textile industry. If the fiber is so easily weakened by water and utterly destroyed by alkaline solutions, how on earth does it survive the industrial dyeing process? I imagine massive vats of boiling water, intense colored pigments, and harsh industrial chemicals. How do they color it without destroying it?
The survival of the fiber during dyeing is a testament to the industry perfectly understanding the underlying organic chemistry. Dyers simply do not use alkalis on wool because wool relies on its unique isoelectric point to highly resist mineral acids. The entire wool dyeing industry operates almost exclusively within controlled acidic environments.
They lean into the chemical loophole.
Exactly. They utilize specific classes of pigments known as acid dyes and mordant dyes. When the wool is submerged in the hot acidic dye bath, the cell membrane complex, that less dense mortar between the cortical cells, softens and expands, allowing the microscopic dye molecules to easily and rapidly penetrate deep into the very core of the cortex.
And then what?
Once inside, the highly absorbent high-sulfur matrix acts like an aggressive sponge, permanently absorbing and chemically locking the large dye molecules into the amorphous protein structure.
And because the entire bath is kept acidic, the disulfide bonds in the keratin structure remain perfectly safe from dissolving.
Precisely. You achieve intensely vibrant, deeply saturated, permanent colors that are locked deep inside the core of the fiber, all without ever compromising the structural integrity of the keratin. It's a perfect chemical synthesis.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap this absolutely unbelievable journey. We started with a living biological organism, a sheep, grazing on an arid hill in Australia or the high plains of New Zealand. We utilized thousands of years of human ingenuity to shear off 20 pounds of raw, heavily contaminated fleece that was comprised of more than half dirt, protective lanolin fat, and potassium salt sheep sweat.
We subjected that raw material to a relentless industrial gauntlet. We washed it, and then we submerged it in a vat of highly concentrated sulfuric acid.
We baked it in an industrial oven at 120 degrees Celsius, relying entirely on the chemical inversion between protein and cellulose to violently dehydrate the plant matter into brittle carbon while the wool protein survived intact. We crushed that carbon into dust under massive iron rollers, shook it clean, and meticulously neutralized the acid.
And then we zoomed into the microscopic realm. We examined the overlapping roof tile scales of the cuticle that create directional friction, permanently latcheting fibers together to create felt, while simultaneously utilizing a waxy layer to repel liquid water but vent internal vapor.
We look at the absolute genius of the cortex, the spiraling, warring halves of the ortho and paracortical cells acting like a biological bimetallic strip, physically fighting each other as they absorb moisture to dynamically generate the bouncy, air-trapping crimp that defines the fiber.
We dug down into the deep, submicroscopic architecture of the microfibril steel rods and the highly absorbent, hydrophilic sulfur concrete matrix that pulls massive amounts of moisture directly out of the air to regulate the microclimate of the wearer.
And we chemically bound all of that massive architecture together with millions of flexible hydrogen magnets, neutralizing ionic salt links, and the ultimate structural anchor, the welded covalent disulfide bonds, all resulting in a fiber that manages temperature, repels water, resists fire, and flexes with the human body.
When you lay the science out sequentially like that, it truly is a masterclass in multicellular biological protein engineering.
So to you, the listener, the next time the weather turns bitter and cold, and you reach into your closet to pull on a finely knit merino sweater, or you wrap a luxurious lightweight cashmere scarf around your neck to brave the winter wind, I want you to pause and remember exactly what you were interacting with. You aren't just wearing clothes. You are wearing billions of microscopic, acid-tested, water-repelling, humidity-venting, self-crimping biological protein springs. You're physically wrapping yourself in the culmination of millions of years of brutal evolutionary adaptation, refined by thousands of years of human agricultural and chemical ingenuity.
Understanding the mechanisms operating at the microscopic level completely reframes how you look at the seemingly mundane textiles sitting in your own home. It elevates them from simple fabrics to highly advanced tools.
It absolutely does. And unpacking the brilliance of this biological machinery leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought. We've spent this entire hour analyzing how humanity has successfully harvested, cleaned, and manipulated this ancient, living technology from animals. But what if the future of advanced human engineering isn't rooted in rigid silicon chips and electronics, but rather in synthetic biology?
That is a staggering direction to take this technology, exploring biomimicry at the molecular level.
Imagine the implications. Imagine if our material scientists and polymer chemists could finally crack the biological code and artificially program synthetic, lab-grown fabrics to perfectly mimic the organic, bimetallic spiraling mechanism of the ortho and paracortex. We wouldn't just be printing static plastic clothes anymore.
We would be creating dynamically responsive materials.
Exactly. Smart clothes that don't require batteries or sensors. Garments that physically alter their microscopic crimp based purely on the ambient humidity of your own physical exertion. Imagine a mountaineering jacket that actively uncoils its fibers to open up and vent heat the moment you start sweating, and then physically crunches down, tightening its microscopic crimp to trap millions of pockets of dead air and instantly insulate you the very second you stop moving and the humidity drops. It would be a garment acting exactly like the living, breathing, adaptive fleece of an American bison in a blizzard.
A synthetic, programmable material that intuitively responds to its environment through engineered structural biology and thermodynamics rather than relying on embedded wires and electronics. That is arguably the holy grail of modern textile science.
It really makes you wonder just how long it will take our brightest minds in state-of-the-art laboratories to invent a piece of technology that is actually better than what nature organically perfected on the back of a sheet millions of years ago. Thank you so much for joining us on this intensely fascinating deep dive. Keep questioning the everyday world around you and stay insanely curious.